Hello again, this is Angelus from Elite PvP, recording tutorial 3 of the tutorial series Let's Make a Memory-Based Bot. In this tutorial, we're going to hook the send and the receive function. Now we're going to start with the send function, and if we have enough time, we're going to cover the send function. But if we don't, I'm going to have to make a part 2 for this tutorial. So, let's get started. Now, I'm going to need two things. I'm going to need my calculator and I'm going to need OLE debug. Now I'm going to be using OLE debug that we have installed in the very first tutorial. And I'm going to start my calculator. Start yours and make sure you are on the programmer view. And let's minimize that for now. Now, I'm going to switch to my OLE debug folder and I'm going to start OLE debug. Now I'm going to start Conquer Online. Next thing, I'm going to switch back to OLE and I'm going to go to File, Attach, and I'm going to attach Conquer.exe, and I'm going to, as you can see, it says pause in the lower right corner. I don't want that. I'll just hit Shift F9 to continue running the process. And let me fix my toolbar real quick. Okay. Now that the process is running, we're going to go to View, Executable Models, or hit Alt-E on your keyboard. It'll bring up this same window. Or you can also access it through these buttons here. You have to hit the button that says E, and it'll bring up the same window. And we're going to find Conquer.exe and double click on it. Now to make sure you are inside the Conquer.exe model, all you gotta do is look at the top or the title of the window here. It says model Conquer. Now we know we're inside Conquer. So what I'm going to do is basically find like a place to start, because in this tutorial we're going to be like tracing the calls backwards until we find our desired or suitable place to hook the send function. So the purpose of hooking the send function is basically to have access to every packet that's going to be sent to the server, and we need to have access to that packet before it's encrypted. So if we have access to it encrypted, we're going to have to implement some encryption stuff and crap in our bot, which we don't want to deal with. We just need to like basically just get a copy of that packet, and maybe sometimes we need to like prevent that packet from being sent to the server, and that's what we're gonna do pretty much. Now let's face it, there's a variety of ways to find a function or to trace a function or something like that. It's just there's multiple approaches and choices that you can do, but in this tutorial we are just going to be tracing it backwards. We're not going to rely on this stack a lot. It could be useful sometimes, but not in this tutorial. We'll just do it backwards, like I said. So anyway, so I need a place to start. To start with, I'm just going to switch back to Conquer Online, and I'm going to log in. Any account, any character, it doesn't matter. Oh god, this annoying message again. Okay, I'm gonna give it a second, and I'm gonna try to log in again. Oh, I'm sorry, let me just make sure there is no breakpoints at all in this process. Now I'm gonna continue running the process. Okay, and I'm gonna try again. This is a hardware breakpoint. I'm sorry, I should have made sure that there is no breakpoints before I started the tutorial. So, my bad. I'm going to log in again. Okay, now that I'm inside the game, what I'm going to do basically is try and do a specific thing, such as jumping, maybe walking, or attacking something, probably sending a chat packet, and see if it'll trigger a certain call in the process, which is the send function. Now, when I say send function, I'm going to go switch back to Ole, click View, Executable Models, and I'm going to look for a model that's called WS2 underscore 32 DLL. Yes, that's the Windows Socket 2 library. So I'm not going to do this right now. I'll just save some time and go back to Conquer.exe. And what I'm going to do is right click, search for, and I'm going to search for all intermodular calls. Now, I'm going to maximize this window, and I'm going to make sure it's sorted based on the destination name. You're going to click this tab here. It'll sort them based on the destination name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my keyboard and I'm going to type send. Now Ole is the topmost window and it'll capture any buttons that you click. Now that if you look at the lower left corner, it'll say search dash send. So I can see that there's 3 calls to the send function inside the WS2 underscore 32 library, which is the Windows Socket library. Now the Windows Socket DLL or library is almost included in every application that uses sockets. Specifically, not specifically, but yeah, most of them. However, now there's 3 calls, but probably there's more than 3 calls in this process, and we need to see or figure out if there's more than 3 calls. What I'm going to do, I'm going to select the very first call, left click on it, and then hit enter, and it'll take you straight where this function is being called. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click or hit on my keyboard. I'm going to hit Control A to analyze my process, and right after I hit Control A, I'm going to hit the space button to interrupt the analysis process. So Control A space right away. It'll break and it'll stop Ole from analyzing the whole thing. Now, as you can see, all these helpful stuff are gone. So what I'm going to do is right click, search. Again, I'm going to search for all intermodular calls, and I'm going to type send again. Now, if I scroll down, you'll notice that we have 4 calls now instead of 3 calls. Now, I'm not going to really explain why. You can go or double click on each one of these calls and see what's going on for yourself. You might understand it on your own. So now that I have almost all these calls to the send function listed, let's select the first one, right click, and I'm going to place a breakpoint on all calls to send. What that will do is place a breakpoint on each one of these calls, but once we do that, one of these breakpoints might be triggered right away. So let's do that now, and as you can see, one of them were really triggered right away. So I'm going to click Control A to analyze the process again. Now one of these send calls will be our start point. That's where we're going to start at tracing the functions backwards to see what called what. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit F9 to continue running the process. Hit the F9 multiple times, or you can just hit this button here, which I'm going to be using more than the F9 just so you can see what I'm doing. So hit it a couple times, make sure it says running on the lower right corner. Okay, thank you for updating my Avast. Go away. Okay, we're going to hit it a couple of times, sorry about that, until it says running. And you can see that it says running here on the lower right corner. And what I'm going to do is switch to the game real quick, and I'm going to try and, let's say, jump or send a chat packet or something uh, like that, you know. I know this could be annoying because it'll keep breaking on this call or some different calls, but it'll work. However, now I'm inside the game and I'm going to try and jump. Okay, it broke. I'm going to try that again. Okay, I'm going to jump. Now it hit this breakpoint here once I jumped. Now I'm not really like 100% sure this breakpoint were triggered because I jumped. So I'm going to try and make sure that's why this breakpoint were triggered. So I'm going to continue running the process. I'm going to go back to Conquer real quick and I'm going to try and walk. Again, the breakpoint were triggered. I'm going to try that again. Go back and I'm going to walk. Again, it would trigger. So you might be wondering why is it being triggered without me doing anything too. It's because the program is basically sending packets even if you're not doing anything. It's just going to keep interacting with the server and it'll keep sending stuff even if you're not doing anything. So let's make sure it's running, and I'm going to go back to the game, and this time I'm going to try and use a skill. So right click to use the shield block and it'll trigger that breakpoint again. So now I'm almost certain that this is the call that sends these stuff to the server. And I think I can start from here. So this is a function right here until this jump here. It'll jump to this function and this function will call this address and then it'll return. So this function here uh, is basically doing stuff and then sending that data to the server, and it then does a couple more things and then it returns. We don't really care for that now. All we need to know that this is the function that calls the send in the WS2 packet library. So what I'm going to do is start and trace this function here. See what calls it. Now I can simply go back to the stack and start following these return addresses. But like I said, the stack is not always reliable because some functions allocate some number of bytes in the stack and you can't really tell what called what or why is it taking too long to return or something like that. And sometimes all you could see is a bunch of zeros here or a bunch of nonsense that you can't really understand. So we're going to stick to this little tiny window here. Now this window here could be really useful and helpful. Now as you can see, I selected the very first instruction of this call, which is push 8 at this address here. This is the beginning of the function. I know that because of this little money sign here. It looks like the money sign. I know this is a beginning of a function, and all is very helpful, and it's highlighting all the code inside this function. That's the body of this function. So if I look down here, it'll say local calls from, and it lists four different addresses. What I understand from this is that this function here is being called from four different places in this model here. So what I'm going to do is basically uh, uh, set a breakpoint on every single call to this function here. So what I'm going to do with the very first instruction selected, which is push 8, I'm going to right click, edit, and I'm going to copy address, or you can hit Alt Insert on your PC and it'll copy the address. Now that I have the address of this function copied, basically I can simply right click on this line here and follow each call and set a breakpoint right on top of this function because I know it's calling it somewhere. Or I can simply go back to where we left, I copied this address. I'm going to right click, search for all contact constants, and I'm going to paste what we just copied, which is this address here. Now if you click OK, it'll list all the calls to this function. Now I'm going to double click on the first one, and I'm going to place a breakpoint here. Now you place a breakpoint by double clicking or hitting the F2. Now the reason I've done that is because it's more easier to do this. I can just simply close this. It'll take me back to this window. Double click, it'll take me to the second address where it's being called. Now I'm going to scroll all the way to the top of this function, and I'm going to double click again to place a breakpoint. Now I can either minimize this or simply close it, and it'll take me to to the other window, which is the search window. I'm going to double click again. This is the third call, and I'm going to scroll all the way to the top, and I'm going to place a breakpoint again by double clicking. And the number 4, and I'm going to place a breakpoint. Now remember, we don't have a lot of time before we get disconnected in the game, because as you can see, the process is paused, meaning it's not sending or processing the packets that it's receiving, and the server sooner or later will notice that, and it'll kick us. So probably we're disconnected by now. So what I'm going to do is keep running on my process by hitting a couple of times on this button. We might be disconnected, but that's not an issue. Okay, now as you can see, this breakpoint specifically is being triggered so many times, and none of the other breakpoints are being triggered after I click run. So what I understand from this is probably this is a thread that's just looping over and over and over. And if I scroll a little down, it says something about received message. It's just catching an exception here. So basically the exception message is going to say received message parameter error blah blah blah. So I know it might be related to the receive, and if it is, it's because the receive function the always loops looking for some data to receive. So I'm going to ignore this as it's a loop. I know it for sure now. And remember what I said about this stack, in that it's not always reliable? It's because of this. Like now, this function alone allocates 8,260 bytes on the stack. So that could be very annoying to scroll all the way and looking for the return address. So it's not that reliable. Anyway, I'm going to continue running my process after I remove that breakpoint. Okay, now we're disconnected. So what I'm going to do, switch back to OLE, view INT3 breakpoints, or hit Alt B. It'll list all these breakpoints, and I'm going to select the very first breakpoint. I'm going to hit the space button to disable it. Now you can see that status had changed to disable. That's what I want to see. I'm going to disable all of these. I'm going to go back to the game and log in. Now the reason I disable these breakpoints, because I don't want them to be triggered while I'm logging into the game. So now that I'm inside the game, I'm going to switch back to OLE, and I'm going to enable these breakpoints again. Now never mind that one of them will be triggered like this. You can always go back to that window with the breakpoint triggered and continue enabling the breakpoints. Now this is the currently triggered breakpoint. I'm going to double click on it. It will take me right where it is. Now I'm going to continue running my process and see if it'll continue running. Now again, as you can see, this looks like another loop. Now I'm not sure, but it's just not letting me continue. It's just going to keep triggering that breakpoint. So I'm going to remove it again. I removed it because I know that call that's calling the send function is not being called like repeatedly. It's being called only when I jump. So it's not being called repeatedly like this function is. So I know this function didn't really call it. So I'm just going to continue running my process. Okay, now the process is running. No breakpoints were triggered. I'm going to go back to Conquer, and I'm going to try and jump again. Now you see one of our two left, the two left breakpoints, the ones that we left, one of them were triggered. So if I look closely on this breakpoint here, where this breakpoint were triggered, it says always guessing this function takes two arguments, argument 1 and argument 2. If I look at the stack, argument 1 looks like a pointer, and argument 2 looks like a number. I don't know what that number is. So I'm just going to right click on the pointer, and I'm going to select this where it says follow and dump. It'll take me to the memory view or the dump view. And as you can see, the very first byte of this buffer here is 26. And if I look here, it says also 26. So that could be a length of a packet, if I'm not wrong. And that could be a packet type. So if I go back to my calculator right here, and I make sure I'm on the hex mode, and I'm going to type 271A. I'm going to switch back to decimal. And as you can see, like for me, I know for sure this is a packet type when it comes to Conquer Online. So I'm getting closer, we're getting somewhere. Now if I convert the number 26 in hex mode to decimal, that's 38. So if I try and count 38 bytes, every row or every line contains 16 bytes. 2 lines is 32 bytes, and 4, that's 36 bytes. Another 2 bytes, that's 38. So that could be a real packet buffer. So I think I'm getting closer. Now, what I'm going to do is continue running my process again. Okay, now that it's running, I'm going to go back to Conquer, and I'm going to try and use or just going to walk this time. So go back to Conquer. No, thank you. And I'm going to walk. Again, the same breakpoint were triggered. Now, if I try and run the process, my second breakpoint, which is located on the send packet function, is supposed to be triggered. So I'm just going to hit run one time. Nothing happened. So again, I have a different buffer here, pointer I mean, and a different number. Let's just go and follow this in though. Again, different length. This could be a packet type too, so let's try and reverse it. And I'm going to type 3F1 back to decimal. That's 1009, and I know this is a packet type in Conquer Online too. So I'm going to continue running my process so just so we don't get disconnected. And I'm going to switch back to Conquer and jump again. Make sure the breakpoint is triggered. Now, if I look at this, let me just fix this. I don't know what happened to it. Please. Okay. Now we have a better view of the CPU window. Now, if I select the very first instruction of this of this function, I can see it says it's called from two different places in this process. So we started with 4 calls, and then now we're down to 2 calls. And what I'm going to do is just right click, go to the first call, and I'm going to scroll all the way to the top of this function, and I'm going to place a breakpoint here. Now hit the star button again to go back where you were, and I'm going to select the second call, and I'm going to place a breakpoint here. Now, for me, I know this function here is a more suitable function to to be our next target than the other function that we just set a breakpoint on. But for the sake of you and to learn some stuff, I'll just leave it the way it is, and I'll just continue running my process. Now, the reason I said that is because probably you will notice by now, if you keep running the process, is that this breakpoint is just keep on being triggered over and over, which is this one. Now, uh, again, if I scroll a little down, again, it's the same thing. It's the same function that we were in earlier. So I'm not really interested in this function, and it's a loop again. So I'm just going to remove this the breakpoint, and I'm going to continue running my process. Now we can see that the process is running. So I'm going to switch back to Conquer, and I'm going to jump again. I didn't do this, so I'm just going to continue running the process, go back, and I'm going to jump. Now, our newly placed breakpoint is being triggered before any other breakpoint, so I know we're almost there, so we're on the right track. So I know that because if you remember, if I go to View, T-3 breakpoints, I placed breakpoints on the calls to the send function in the Windows socket library. But what makes me so confident is that none of these 3 calls or 4 calls that we place the breakpoints on is being triggered before this function here. So this function is being triggered, this breakpoint is being triggered on this function before any of the other breakpoints. So I'm confident we are in the right place because it works like a tree. It's like a chained series of calls. Every call or every function calls the second function, and the second function calls the third function, and the third function calls the fourth function. So if I have a breakpoint on the fourth function, it's impossible for the breakpoint on the fourth function to be triggered before the breakpoint on the first function if it's not being called anywhere else in the process. So because of that, I know we're in the right place. So now that I've explained that, I think we're in the right place here. And if I look closely here, I have a pointer to, let's follow it in dump. Again, it's a packet buffer, I can tell. If you don't, you just have to try and switch these numbers from hex to decimal and see what's going on, try and understand if it makes sense to you. Now, this could be the packet length too, and if I compare this number here with this number here, it's the same. So I think we're close. Now I'm going to run the process a couple of times to make sure we're not disconnected. Now go back, wait. Now go back to the game and jump again. Okay, same breakpoint were triggered. Now, how many times this function is being called in the process? Now all is guessing it takes 2 arguments too, and we took a look at the arguments and they're very very useful. They look promising. So I'm going to go back to this little tiny window, or you can still use your stack here to go back to where it's being called using the return address. But I'll just stick to this little tiny window here. So I'm going to hit this star button, and then I'm going to go back to where it says local calls from, and I'm going to right click, go to call, and it will take me to this function here. Now OI is guessing this function is a void. It doesn't take any arguments. Let's see where it's being called. Click on the first instruction of that function, and if you look closely here, right click, list jumps and calls. Look how many times this function is being called in this model. Hundreds of times, literally. So we know this function is heavily used in this process. So that could be very useful because I know this process is huge and it sends hundreds of different of packets to the server with different types. So it's very likely that this is where we need to break, or this is our next targeted function. I'm just going to double click here to set a breakpoint on this function because I know it's calling our next function at this address here, and it's this call. And if I hit enter, it'll take me right where our breakpoint is placed now. I'm going to continue running the process all the way. Okay, now it's running. I'm going to go back to conquer and I'm going to jump again. Boom, that breakpoint, the last breakpoint we placed were triggered. So now that we're here, we're almost close to this. So it's impossible almost to uh, follow all of these calls, okay, and see what might be a suitable function to hook maybe or something. Uh, that's A. B, I think we're in the right place for now. So let's just, what I'm gonna do is now I know this function here or this call, somewhere along the line it calls the send function in the Windows socket library. But do any of these calls here, the red ones, do any of these calls really call the send function inside the Windows socket library too? To make sure that it's not, I'm just going to hit the F8 button a couple of times. Keep on the F8, F8. Now, as long as none of the breakpoints that we put on the calls to the send function inside the Windows Socket 2 library, none of them were triggered, I know that none of them were called. But to make sure, you can always go back to these breakpoints, go back inside the Windows Socket library itself and place a breakpoint here to be like definite that none of them did. But we're not going to do that, so I'm just going to go back to View Executable Models Conquer, and I'm going to hit the star button to go back where I left. Now, with that done, if I look closely at the arguments of this call here, it takes also a pointer to a buffer. There it is. And a length, which is the same length of that buffer. So to me, that looks like a very convenient place to hook this function. Now to make sure that I'm in the right place, I'm going to delete this breakpoint here. I'm going to go View INT3 breakpoints, and I'm going to delete all of these breakpoints. Now I'm going to go back to the CPU, and I'm going to, if you lost your way here, if there's a breakpoint anywhere triggered in the process, if you hit the star button, it'll always take you where that breakpoint is, or to the current pointer for the debugger. So what I'm going to do is right click on this call here, and I'm going to go breakpoint hardware, and I'm going to make sure it's on execution, and I'm going to hit OK. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this whole function from the first instruction until the return address. I'm going to right click, edit, copy as table. Now I'm going to go open a notepad, and I'm going to pretty much Control V to paste what I just copied. Now the reason I did this is because sometimes you might lose your breakpoint, sometimes you might crash the process, sometimes whatever, and you might lose your whole progress. So it's better to have something to go back to if the process crashes. So now that I've done this, all I gotta do now is continue running the process all the way until it's running. Okay, we got disconnected. Now let's go back to Ollie. Right click on that breakpoint, and I'm going to go breakpoint hardware disable. Okay, you can see it's disabled by because it's gonna change from red to yellowish. Anyway, uh, I'm going to switch to Conquer and I'm going to log in. Now that I'm logged in, I'm going to switch back to Ole, and I'm going to right click breakpoint, and I'm going to enable it. Now it might be triggered anytime soon, but before it's triggered, I'm going to switch real quick to Conquer, and I'm going to jump. Again, that breakpoint were triggered, and if I follow this in dump, I can tell that this is the a packet type, and it has the jump packet subtype. Now I know that because I've debugged this process hundreds of times, but for you, you can always figure it out. So I'll just continue running the process, and I'm going to switch back to Conquer again, and I'm going to try and use a skill. Let's right click to use the shield block. Now with the breakpoint, we're triggered again. Let's follow this pointer in dump again, and I see it has a length of 28 by now, and it has a packet type of 3FE. Switch to decimal, that's the melee attack packet type. Anyway, now we're in the perfect place to place our hook, and what we're going to do next is to hook this function. Okay, I paused the video and I looked at the video length and stuff, and it's like almost 36 minutes by now. So I paused the video, I cleaned all that crap, and right now I'm going to prepare to code, or yeah, we're going to prepare the code to hook that function inside our DLL project. So what I'm going to do is just end this video for now, and we're going to record a part 2. So go and watch part 2 if you're interested and you want to know how to hook that function in our project.